Do people in Taiwan fear China? Like, it's hardly going to start with a full-scale invasion, is it? How is Donald Trump viewed in Taiwan? Do students in Taiwan take drugs? Are you optimistic about the future of Taiwan overall? Okay, so today I'm talking to Brian Hioe, is that right?
Brian Hioe. Might as
Hioe?
well be H-U-G-H.
Okay, sorry for that. Yeah, my Asian pronunciation isn't very good yet. But so, am I correct in saying you're a journalist, author, DJ, and activist? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I founded an independent media 11 years ago, and it's been, I guess, the rest is history. So that's New Bloom magazine. And I write on Taiwanese social issues, politics, also arts and culture, and then I DJ. I do various things on the side.
Okay, and what's the media structure like in Taiwan? So is there legacy media newspapers that are struggling, like all legacy newspapers are, and independents cropping up, or how's that working at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is legacy media, often newspapers, television outlets, etc. But then they did modernize with the rise of the internet. And so they have online websites, ad revenue from that. But then particularly 11 years ago, around the time of the Sunflower Movement, which was a student movement that I was a participant in, there was a wave of new media, independent media. And so we'd count ourselves as among that wave.
Okay, nice. And so we're just talking off air before we began. So you're saying podcasts are just taking off now in Taiwan? Yeah,
yeah,
it's
correct? Actually kind of surprising because podcasts have been around for a while. But then suddenly there was this explosion. And I'm not sure why, but there was a few years where people are not really listening to podcasts. And it was actually a bit puzzling. But now people listen to podcasts.
Okay, and when did that explosion happen?
Good question. It might be actually around COVID, I think around then. So it's also possible that people were at home and just listened more to things. Interesting.
And actually, so there seems to be like quite a strong independent journalist landscape in Taiwan now, because when I was looking for someone to speak to, I managed to find quite a few names easily, whereas in Ireland, so where I come from, most of the journalists would be tied to a legacy media outlet. There probably wouldn't be independent reporters, researchers, journalists. So is that more common here, do you think, in Taiwan?
I think most people, Taiwanese journalists, are still very often tied to legacy media, but there are more and more freelancers, and I think that's generally the case with media across the world. And so then I think particularly in the English language, you do have historically a lot more freelancers floating around.
Okay. And has that added to the political discourse? Has it introduced maybe new ways of thinking? Do you think it's made for more nuanced discourse, or has it just complicated things too much? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's actually improved the discourse. I think there's much more independent journalists that are interested in long-form reporting, more detailed reporting, rather than this kind of clickbait that legacy media often engages in.
Yeah.
And that's a real issue, I think, in the media reporting.
Okay, so Substack has become quite big, definitely in the US. Mm-hmm. Maybe, again, I haven't seen many Irish Substacks, so maybe not in Europe as much. Is that taken off here at all? So Substack?
Substack, not really, but that kind of model, there have been a few attempts to do that. It's the kind of subscription style model, Patreon-like. There's one, SOS Reader, that later became Vocus. A few others, like translocalism. Not all of those survived, but then there are attempts to create these kind of new revenue models for journalism.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think Substack is good. Well, I think maybe at the moment, the latest trend is there's a lot of celebrities entering Substack, which is maybe diluting the impact of maybe people who made a name on Substack, or people who just want to write independently. Because obviously, if it's exhausted with celebrities or big name writers, people are maybe less likely to find niche Substacks that they'd enjoy, because they're going to be more pulled towards the big names. But there isn't a major algorithm on Substack yet that favors, I guess, big names. So that might be saving grace there. Okay, so a few questions. So the Taiwan history is really, really interesting. So obviously we're not going to do a history lesson, but if we just go back to the start. So I'm right in saying the nationalist government came here, left China in 1948 after losing the Chinese Civil War, and set up maybe a provisional government, or what was meant to be a temporary government here in Taiwan, and they ended up staying. Is that kind of the...
Yeah, that's right in the broad strokes. There's a longer history of Taiwan in terms of hundreds of years of settlement. Around 90% of the population are here from before the Chinese Nationalist Party arrived in Taiwan. But it's correct to say that the modern history of Taiwan, in terms of authoritarianism followed by democratization, can be traced back to that period. Okay. So are the majority of Taiwan citizens today, can they trace their ancestry in Taiwan back to the Qing dynasty, is it, or the Qing dynasty? Ming and Qing settlement in terms of ethnic Han from China kind of settling Taiwan. But of course, there was the indigenous population that's, depending on how you count, between 2 and 5% of the population. They're here from thousands of years. Okay. And is there still a visible separate indigenous population today in Taiwan? Yes, that's right. Okay. And so Taipei is a city that's very much dominated by those that came with the KMT. But then you go to Hualien or other parts of Taiwan, the south and central Taiwan or the eastern, coast, and it's much more visible in terms of indigenous settlements and villages and so forth.
Okay. And so I guess the original Nationalist Party was the KMT.
Yes.
When they arrived here, did they just immediately force their way into power, or was it gradual, or how did that play out?
Yeah, so the inhabitants of Taiwan then had just gone through 50 years of Japanese colonization. And so the KMT was initially welcomed as liberators, as returning to the nation. But then they quickly started to purge the intelligentsia, the landed gentry that could be a force of resistance against them. And so that was the start of the period known as the White Terror that began with the 228 massacre.
And did they purge the intelligentsia because of fear of maybe socialist ideas, or was it just anyone who opposed them?
It was a combination of both, but it's also very true that socialist ideas were quite common in the intelligentsia at that point in time.
Yeah, maybe always. I don't know. So I guess, so was there any genuine movement towards communism in Taiwan from the 1950s onwards? Like, was there any like grassroots communist movement that had any strength in numbers, or was it always pretty niche and maybe on the fringes?
Yeah, in the past there was, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, late 40s, of course. And so there was, for example, a Taiwanese Communist Party, there were uprisings. And it's interesting because even the pro-independence camp, in fact, traces roots back to these leftists from that period. And so there was already a kind of split in terms of identity about Taiwan or China, even back then among the political left. But as time goes on, then you, of course, have the rise of communist China, and there is a loyalty to it among some people. But then the serious presence of leftism in Taiwan is then cracked down on from that point on, though there's always this fear-mongering about the communist infiltrators that is used to justify the security apparatus at that point in time.
So it's kind of like the Red Scare in the US?
Yes, it's a period known as the White Terror. So it's, in that sense, similar. And white is the party color of the KMT.
Okay, yeah. And so talk a bit about the White Terror. Like, how is that remembered today in modern Taiwanese society? And, like, do people still hold it against the KMT? Has the KMT apologized for it or taken responsibility? Like, do they justify it as maybe something that was necessary at the time to maybe quell maybe communist forces? How are they viewed today?
Yeah, it was a combination of all those things. And so there were apologies made, but then today's KMT has much more double down on the period. For example, claiming that the current government is engaged in a green terror, quote unquote, worse than the white terror. If so, where are the dead bodies? I have no idea. Okay. But there's this denialism that is really set in.
So what do they claim is the green terror? What's that?
They claim it's very unclear because nobody's being politically killed, of course. And so that is when there is political activity organizing from activists against the KMT, such as in the form of political recalls. They claim this is a green terror. And it's rather absurd, but then the KMT, it's another way in which they refuse to reckon with the past in that sense.
Okay, that's interesting. And who actually supports the KMT? Like, I guess in Europe, legacy. So I presume Taiwan is like a multi-party system. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So in Europe, in multi-party systems, maybe the legacy parties are the major parties who've had a long history, are kind of supported by older generations. Is that the case here? Yeah.
It's also the case that those that are descended from those that came with the KMT to Taiwan, the older generations are much more strongly supported. I mean, I'm even included in that. But I don't support the KMT. I'm very much against it. But I'm descended from those that came with the KMT to Taiwan. And so, for example, a lot of my family still supports the KMT, but the young people don't. And that's pretty, I think, universal. And so the KMT has really suffered in its support from young people. A few years ago, it had less than 10,000 members under 40.
Okay, interesting. You may not know much about Irish history or politics, but as I was reading about Taiwan, it's actually pretty clear there's a lot of parallels because Ireland, we have two main or legacy parties in Ireland. So we have Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and those parties actually go back to the Civil War 100 years ago, directly after independence. And again, like, I guess their grip on power is after dying out now. Neither has anything like a majority, but again, in older generations, it was actually family loyalty that was tied to either side, depending on what side they're on, the Civil War and things like that. So there is parallels there between Irish politics and Irish history and Taiwan. So what about language in Taiwan? So again, when the KMT arrived, did they kind of try and implement Chinese as the main language, but maybe there was other dialects, and have they been preserved or have they largely faded away?
Yeah, and so the KMT came to Taiwan and tried to institute Mandarin as the official language. And what was spoken in Taiwan was among the ethnic Han population, Taiwanese Hokkien, and also Japanese, because they've gone through the Japanese colonial period. And there are, of course, indigenous languages, but also many people were educated in the Japanese political system. And so then there was the attempt on cracking down on the speaking of Taiwanese Hokkien or non-Mandarin languages. It's also very ironic because the KMT itself, many people from the KMT did not speak very good Mandarin. There's an attempt to create an official state language in those years. But then even, for example, Chiang Kai-shek, the dictator, who's the head of the KMT, he was not the most fluent Mandarin speaker. He's
Really?
a Zhejiangese person, so he spoke Zhejiangese. And so he was even subtitled on television when he appeared.
Okay. And why did they choose Mandarin then? Just because it was a way of centralizing a language, or why was Mandarin chosen by the KMT? Because it links to the mainland.
It is the official language of Beijing, and so it's the for the capital city. So for Chinese empires, it was pre-modern Chinese empires. That was always the official language for the scholar official system. So in that sense, it does make sense actually to choose that as the lingua franca.
Okay. And is there any efforts to preserve other languages or indigenous languages in Taiwan today? Or are they mostly faded?
Absolutely. There's a lot of attempts to preserve that. Particularly young people who are ethnically Han, there's attempts to create kind of new romanization systems to make teaching of Taiwanese Hokkien easier, but also to pass down this knowledge to children who may not have a language environment. But it's still more widely spoken not outside of Taipei, in the central and southern Taiwan. And then indigenous language activists are also working on various efforts to particularly encourage young people in an age of social media in which people are very easily distracted to have language environments, to have content that they consume in indigenous languages.
Okay. And how is Chiang Kai-shek viewed today? Walking around Taiwan, I've definitely seen maybe memorials to him and I think place names after him. So how is he viewed among maybe young Taiwanese and older generations as well in the 21st century?
Absolutely. So there's an older generation that still does venerate him to a large extent. They view him as a hero. But then even the KMT has backed away from officially venerating Chiang Kai-shek. They instead focus on his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, who succeeded him as dictator, but was also credited in some way with not cracking down on the democratic movements and allowing for democratization to occur. And so there's that kind of shift in focus, but then you still see the debate around whether to preserve the Chiang Kai-shek memorial or not. You see a lot of places named Zhongzhen, and that's Chiang Kai-shek's kind of honorific name. And so there's still many hundreds of streets in Taiwan that are named this, and there are statues of him everywhere. And so there's all this discussion regarding transitional justice. How do we deal with his past?
Okay, that's very interesting. And so I actually saw you reviewed I think it was a movie or it was a TV series recently that maybe touched on the White Terror. So I was trying to get my head around the nuances of that. So was that trying to kind of portray a sympathetic maybe angle towards the KMT and maybe I guess reduce the impact of the White Terror? Could you talk a bit about that? Because I'm curious.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the Zheng Bongheng film, The Embers. Yeah. And that was a very puzzling film because it's a murder mystery where a victim of the White Terror, or rather a descendant of a victim of the White Terror, decides to carry out revenge on the political that committed these political killings or murders or imprisonments in the past. And that's not what I think the victims want today. But it just uses the White Terror as this kind of frame for a murder mystery. And it's just rather clunky as a movie, but also it's just rather politically questionable because I don't think people want that in terms of calling for justice. There are many cases in which people and their families, including children, were killed, and there's still not official answers. And some of these killings, the latest ones, took place in the late 80s.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize it was that recent. Oh my God, that was extremely recent. How is Japan viewed in Taiwan today? Because obviously, Taiwan was colonized by Japan, but Japan didn't commit the same atrocities, as far as I know, in Taiwan that they did in Nanking in mainland China, because they didn't go to war with Taiwan. Taiwan wasn't part of the Sino-Japanese War. And obviously, Japan did contribute to infrastructure and modernization and industrialization of Taiwan. So, is the Japanese period viewed in a kind of a nuanced fashion, in a positive light, or mostly negatively?
It depends on who we talk to, but It's absolutely right. The historical verdict on Japan is very different. You look at South Korea, for example, and they took down all the Japanese architecture. That's not the case in Taiwan. You go around, you see a lot of it, and their efforts to preserve it. In particular, there were uprisings against the Japanese, whether from ethnic Han or indigenous, but then that is, it depends on who you talk to, how they remember the Japanese. For those descended from the KMT or with pan-blue views are aligned with the KMT, Japan is remembered as a colonizer.
Okay.
For those descended from those in prior waves of migration to Taiwan, oftentimes, Japan is looked at more positively than the KMT that came after, modernizing and killing less people. And so then there's this kind of romanticization of that period, in fact.
Okay, really?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. So in mainland China, so I just traveled mainland China for the last few weeks, there's a huge emphasis on the century of humiliation and obviously the colonization of China and the exploitation of China by different colonial forces. And maybe it's probably linked to modern Chinese nationalism as well. There's nothing equivalent to that in Taiwan, is there? Like Taiwan embraces the West much more. Is that correct?
It depends on who you talk to. I think the KMT sometimes still does have a similar century of humiliation narrative and this view that the West is declining and China's rise is inevitable, and therefore Taiwan should hitch its wagons to China. And so that rhetoric still comes up, so it really does depend as well.
That's really weird because, again, this is very nuanced. I was trying to get my head around this, but it seems like the KMT is more in favor of maybe more dialogue with Beijing and more economic integration with Beijing, even though they fought the communists in the Chinese Civil War.
It's a very puzzling thing.
Yeah.
As someone who is descended from the KMT and was part of a giant movement against the KMT 11 years ago, they changed a lot on China. And so they're much more pro-China. They're pro-unification because they came to Taiwan and framed Taiwan as quintessentially always being Chinese. And that loyalty to this abstract Chinese nation has now taken precedence. And the wars of yesteryear are then forgotten.
Okay.
It's quite interesting. You'll have military veterans, for example, that literally fought against China, then get into spying cases where they leak military secrets to the People's Republic of China today and the People's Liberation Army. And so it's quite interesting.
But yeah, like, do the KMT want integration with China under a communist system, or do they want integration with China under maybe a different system in the future? Like, is it more an abstract idea, or is it kind of immediate increased closeness to Beijing? Like, what's going on there?
It depends on who you talk to as well in the KMT, but it's very abstract. And some people will want Taiwan to maintain its democracy. Some people will say that China is, in fact, very democratic today. And so you also have people that believe that in the KMT.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I can tell you for a fact, after spending a couple of weeks in China, it's not very democratic.
Absolutely.
No, definitely not. There's some strange nuances in China as well, in mainland China. So we were in Tiananmen Square. It was just kind of by chance that we arrived there first thing in the morning for the flag raising ceremony, because we had something else on later in the day. We didn't actually even realize there was a flag raising ceremony. But you could really see like a sense of nationalism. Like there was young Chinese, maybe my age or younger, singing the national anthem, like kids waving flags of the People's Republic of China. And yet you had like an image of Mao like elevated at the end of the square. And I was just kind of thinking to myself, like, surely some of these people were directly affected by the terrors that Mao inflicted on China. So I don't get how you square that, like how they accept that and still can stand the square despite perhaps like maybe relatives of them having suffered under the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It is quite interesting, but I think that we look at, for example, someone like the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, and he spent years living in a cave during the Cultural Revolution. And
yeah, I saw that.
Now today he's carrying out political purges. And so there's a kind of acceptance of that. And even having suffered through experiences like that sometimes still means loyalty to the nation.
Yeah.
And so it is quite puzzling. It is actually kind of alarming in that sense as well, because there's still this sense of humiliation when China's already a great power. And so then this desire to avenge that can be quite dangerous for other countries in the region, including Taiwan, but also others. Okay,
yeah, interesting. And so there's two narratives, I guess two kind of academic or popular narratives that I've read about China before arriving there. So some people characterize the CCP and Xi Jinping as a fascist totalitarian. Obviously the surveillance state and the kind of, I guess, maybe the controlled or planned economy. But then others, like, for instance, there's a guy called Kevin Rudd, who I think was the former Australian Prime Minister. He kind of characterizes like Xi Jinping as moving back towards maybe Marxist-Leninist ideas and trying to make China more puritanical in a communist sense domestically, and maybe more nationalist or right-wing on a geopolitical front or on foreign policy. So do you think that modern-day China fits more into the fascist category or the communist category? Like what do you think is a fair assessment, or do you think it's a bit of both?
Yeah, I think that, I view myself as on the political left. And so I tend to think China today is incredibly hyper-capitalist. It's a tremendously unequal society that frames itself as communist. And there is this appeal to the rhetoric of the past, but in reality, it is justifying these very powerful oligarchs that have made tremendous money as being part of the party state. And so I think it's very hard to call that a left government. But it still does have this historical legacy, and it still does frame itself that way, though.
Okay. So you think it's more like centrally planned capitalism with intense competition. You don't think it's in any way a communist or a socialist society?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is a state capitalism is sometimes how people term it. There are various forms of terms that people come up with to describe it, but that does seem to be one way to look at it.
Okay, interesting. And since Xi came into power, is there definitely more of a right wing or nationalist tilt in geopolitics and foreign policy? Like, has that always been there, and is it just more obvious now, or has Xi really is he after pushing that and emphasizing that?
It's become much more obvious, and it's very interesting because before Xi, China was seen as liberalizing and becoming much more open. And then that stopped when Xi took power. Xi was expected to continue these reforms, and he turned out to be the opposite. Instead, a kind of very strengthening the powers of the state, being very nationalistic. And so it made a huge difference, I think, when he took power.
Yeah, because obviously, like in the 70s, you had this move towards socialism with Chinese characteristics.
That's right, as Deng Xiaoping said.
Yeah, exactly. Would you say that approach is gone, or at least faded significantly?
I think it was always an attempt to embrace capitalism, though, while just claiming this rhetoric of the past. And so I think particularly leftism has been just framed and depicted in a way that's basically just Chinese nationalism when it comes down to that.
Okay.
And so socialism with Chinese characters is, in fact, Chinese characteristics. That's the main part.
Okay.
And
without
that
socialism.
Can be anything. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Okay, fair. And yeah, because obviously, like socialism, you associate socialism with labor movements and grassroots politics in its purest form, but there's nothing like that in China. So
absolutely,
you
have the decimation of grassroots NGOs, labor unions. Only ones that are state controlled are allowed to exist. And in that sense, you don't have this kind of grassroots organizing in China.
Yeah, definitely not. And so has Chinese propaganda, especially on social media, has that infiltrated Taiwan? Or like, obviously they've tried to infiltrate Taiwan with it, but has it had any influence on the mindset or the views of Taiwanese people?
Yeah, I think for both young and old people. I mean, there's a concern about TikTok everywhere in the world, and also Red Note, and that's also the case with young people in Taiwan.
Okay.
And so this view that China's bigger and better, and that it's there's more economic opportunities there.
Yeah.
That narrative is framed for young people, but for older people, it's often this kind of abstract nationalism in the form of just there's a lot of disinformation that circulates, including conspiratorial ones. For example, saying that the U.S. created COVID-19 as a bioweapon.
I saw that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that happens, but it is generally the case that there is disinformation and affects different demographics, actually.
Okay, interesting. And do you think that, like, in terms of young people, like, do you think young people maybe look at China as an area of opportunity? Like, is there any immigration from Taiwan to mainland China? Do they see maybe young Chinese as better off or having better economic opportunities because of the propaganda, or is there anything going on there?
Yeah, I mean, there's still an enormous Taiwanese diaspora population in China, hundreds of thousands. And so there's still a lot of migration there. And so it's interesting. There's a famous sociologist, Wu Jieming. He wrote a book, The Third Imagination of China. And his argument is that there are historically two ways Taiwanese view China. One is as a money-making opportunity. You go there and make your riches. The other is fear-mongering, that you're just afraid of it. And he calls for a more critical approach. That's not either of these two approaches. And so his argument is the third view of China, and he argues for that. And I think that's still very much how often young people or other people view China. Either just they think it's the future, it's great, it's amazing, or it's terrible, it's dangerous, and it is an authoritarian country, sure, but the truth is somewhere in between there.
Yeah. So over the last few years, there's been this rise of like maybe influencers on YouTube going to China and saying how surprised they are by China and how maybe advanced it is. Now, to be honest, I was a bit skeptical of that because obviously the surveillance state. And when I got there, so cities like Chongqing are impressive. But at the same time, I'm trying to, the way they build Chongqing into the natural landscape with the gorges and the rivers and having to almost create a vertical city is impressive. But at the same time, I feel like they're just using excessive LED light to maybe present it as a futuristic or cyberpunk city. And I don't know, will it have lasting value like somewhere like Paris or New York? But I think the Chinese maybe want people to think that their cities are futuristic or the way of the future.
It's the attempt is to do that, but also many neighborhoods have been demolished to make way for this very high-tech city, working class neighborhoods, migrants. There's still tremendous inequality in China, but also a lot of the history. I mean, I spent time in China, and some of the history has been destroyed. For example, the Hutan district in Beijing is very distinctive. And they just went and knocked it all down and built these kind of replicas there. And so I think sometimes China has thrown a lot of what could in fact be lasting culture overboard and this desire just to build up this capitalist cityscape.
Yeah, definitely. Because again, I visited many Hutong districts in Beijing, and the ones that are left are really beautiful and really impressive. So it really is a pity that China and the Beijing government got rid of so many of them, destroyed it for the purpose of building modern infrastructure. And as well, I believe a lot of people were forcibly relocated and maybe not in a just way when the Hutongs were overrun. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And so when there are fires or accidents, it's often used as a pretext to drive people out of neighborhoods. And just demolish it and build a shopping mall.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Can we just talk about nationalism for a second in Taiwan? So again, just to go back to Ireland again, where I'm from. So we have a complex relationship with nationalism because we have 32 counties, so the country is divided in 32 counties. We only have 26, so 6 are still under British rule.
Yes,
okay, so
right.
the northeast of the country is still under British rule. So again, some people, maybe the centrist view of nationalism in Ireland is for the Republic, so there's 26 counties within the EU and the success of the Republic. But obviously there's a minority who really favour an aggressive policy towards unification. They're represented politically by a group called Sinn Féin, who had their own, who can be traced back to a militant wing called the IRA and the Provisional IRA, who committed some terrible atrocities up until the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And then also you have a third faction. You have about 1 million unionists, so people who genuinely believe they're British, who live in the north and northeast. So again, you might have several different views of Irish nationalism. So it's quite complex. And I guess the same is true in Taiwan, because obviously some Taiwanese probably view themselves as as Taiwanese, separate to China, and some want maybe greater integration with China. So talk a bit about nationalism in Taiwan and what forms it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also very interesting because things are very much changing among my generation. I mentioned that my family, for example, they're originally from the KMT. But then third generation mainlanders such as myself often identify with Taiwan rather than China. And so it's very rare that you have young people that identify with China. But there is still an older generation that does. And so you look at identity polls and the young people overwhelmingly identify as Taiwanese, but the older generation, it's a bit more mixed, but that's also declining. And so you still do have people that are pro-unification, but that is increasingly a minority. However, that does mean it doesn't mean the KMT just doesn't win in elections, because there are people that view it safer as having it in power, because then China may not attack. Or they just view it as better at managing the economy, because appealing to this past period in which it was the one ruling party. And so there's still these splits politically, and also between political identities. But I think things are changing, and Taiwan will look very different in a few decades.
In what way?
It'll just be people that identify as Taiwanese.
Okay.
And, that may mean different things. You may be indigenous, you may be a mainlander, you may be Wenshengren, that's the term for those that came from prior waves of migration, but you still see yourself as Taiwanese as defined in terms of shared cultural values, which are tied to democracy.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess observing the streets of Taiwan versus and Taipei versus the streets of any Chinese city, there's more cultural diversity in Taiwan. People dress more freely. In mainland China, almost everybody dresses the same, or the same look. Obviously there's one ideal that people go for. Maybe it's to do with social classes, but in Taiwan it looks more like the West, as in people kind of seem to dress to express themselves individually a bit more. Is that a correct analysis, or is it a bit reductive?
It's a good question. I'm not sure, but I think also in the past Taiwan was also like that, because Taiwan did go through an authoritarian period. For example, men were forbidden for having long hair, and so there's a lot of kind of institution of just uniform appearance in society. But then with democratization, of course, that changes, and people open up and are much more free to express themselves in various ways.
Yeah. For instance, until I got to Yunnan province, so I didn't see one person with a fade. So fade haircuts are really big in the West. So I didn't see one fade until I got to Yunnan. So maybe I was thinking Yunnan has more influence from Southeast Asia. So they have a bit more of maybe a hipster culture. But there was very little of that in most of China. But I noticed a palpable difference in maybe openness and maybe willingness to speak to foreigners when we got to Yunnan. But maybe that's because of tensions with the US as well. Maybe people thought that we were from the US. I'm not sure. Taiwan people are extremely friendly. I found that since we've been here, really helpful, really friendly, really open. So yeah, you have a nice society.
It's a good question. I think people in China, sometimes they're afraid to talk to people because of fear that you're associating with spies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
But also there's a very marked decline in the number of foreigners that travel to China in the past decade. It's very striking, in fact.
Okay.
And so that's another big thing. There's much more tourism in the past.
Okay, interesting. Do people in Taiwan fear China and Xi and the CCP? Like, is there a fear? And do people think that an invasion or some kind of violation of Taiwanese sovereignty is inevitable, or what's the public thought on that?
Yeah, I think there is an implicit fear of China, but it's very much, people are very used to it. It's been around as a threat for decades.
Okay.
There's been missiles pointed at Taiwan for most people's lifetimes. And so it's just kind of in the background as noise.
Okay.
But there is the fear of Xi, because I think China took a very different turn after he took power.
Okay, yeah. So you think since maybe Xi has come to power, and especially since the crackdown in Hong Kong, has that fear become more obvious in Taiwan? Are people maybe more worried about it?
It's interesting because even then, even with the events in Hong Kong, it comes and goes in waves. There are times in which people, often around the time of presidential elections, become much more afraid. Other times, people don't react. And it's interesting because China is often launching these military drills and exercises. The public usually doesn't react because it just kind of is background noise.
Okay, interesting.
It's usually other things in the world that cause a kind of concern or fear of China.
Like what?
It's often, I think, just the possibility of the KMT taking power, or it may be an issue that Taiwan can project itself onto. For example, Hong Kong or Ukraine offer visions of a potential future for Taiwan. And so those two led to much more concern about this threat from China.
Yeah, so has the fact that the maybe post-World War II global order broken down, and maybe you no longer have an internationalist president in the US, has this also added to the fear? So like you said, maybe other factors outside of China can increase, global political factors can increase this fear because it maybe opens the gate for Chinese intervention in Taiwan. So has Donald Trump, let's call a spade a spade, has his election to the White House and his maybe even more extremist rhetoric in his second term, has that enhanced fear?
Yeah, I think so. There's much more concern that America is not a reliable partner as it may have been in the past. Although it is true that America backed the authoritarian KMT for decades in the interest of anti-communism. Yeah. But then, particularly with Trump withdrawing from all these international agreements and just being very unpredictable, I think there's more concern. And so there's much more skepticism in the U.S. and its reliability, much more talk of self-reliance. But for Taiwan, which is an island, that is in fact quite difficult.
Yeah, that's the same with my country. Again, we're very much an open trading country because we can't be self-reliant. We depend heavily on global trade. And again, we're also being affected by Trump's maybe more isolationist rhetoric because we rely a lot on American pharmaceutical companies for our economic base, and again Trump is threatening that in a major way, which is I think worrying people at home as well. Is Taiwan very dependent on maybe a few sectors, especially semiconductors? Has the economy diversified enough?
Yeah, that's actually one of the concerns, is that Taiwan is very dependent on semiconductors, and that affects stock, for example. The markets are very impacted by anything Trump says. And so there's that. I think Taiwan does need to diversify. Taiwan managed to build up the semiconductor industry without attracting a lot of international attention until COVID. And that was, I think, more or less by design. But now people are much more concerned about that as a choke point and danger, I think, in terms of economic over-reliance on Taiwan. But Taiwan wants to maintain that foothold so that people are still invested in Taiwan's defense. And so that creates a kind of dilemma. But also, being an island, Taiwan is reliant on, for example, energy imports, such as liquefied natural gas, etc. And so that is something that an invasion or a blockade would potentially cut off. So Taiwan also thinking about ways to deal with that.
Yeah. Do you think the most likely intervention from China would be something like a blockade, or maybe there's another smaller island that's actually under Taiwanese jurisdiction? Is it called
Jingmen? Yes.
Yeah. So do you think maybe a minor intervention to start would be the way the Chinese would go about it? It's hardly going to start with a full-scale invasion, is it? Some people say it might, but the most likely thing is something smaller, like a blockade of Taiwan or some other kind of breach of their sovereignty.
Yeah, definitely a intermediate scenario such as a blockade is much more likely, because if you commit boots on the ground, it would be the largest beachhead invasion since D-Day. And so you would have to commit hundreds of thousands of troops that will just be mowed down. And can the Chinese Communist Party survive having not fought a war in 40 years, just having all this young people just go up and smoke? And then that means a more likely scenario is a blockade to try to force Taiwan to surrender while not destroying the infrastructure. Because the other challenge is then, as I think Ireland's experience also shows, is maintaining occupation is very hard for an outside power, because you will have, in fact, the rise of domestic pushback, domestic terrorism, in fact, against the occupying force.
Do you think that Taiwan would would it take maybe an increasing nationalist tilt if Beijing did try to preach Taiwan freedom and independence a bit more?
Yes, it's possible. I think particularly, for example, if they attack Jingmen, that could become a Crimea scenario where, in fact, that encourages militarization in Taiwan to deal with that threat. And so it's always debated, would China actually try to do that with an outlying island or not? Because that would potentially push Taiwan towards much stronger measures on defense.
Okay. And does Taiwan, as it stands right now, have a strong military capacity and defense capacity, or is it lagging?
It is lagging. It's, for example, there's a lot of confidence in the military. You always have these accents reporting on the news. There's questions about the draft. Soldiers do not fire many bullets during their training. Yeah. People don't learn first aid. It's actually a bit concerning.
Okay.
But it's actually very similar to Ukraine in 2014, in fact, in which the military was also seen as rather ill-equipped.
Yeah.
But then Crimea happened, and there was the strong push for reforms in the military.
Yeah, you would think with like an advanced technological economy like Taiwan that it would be able to conduct warfare similar to Ukrainians, like this advanced technological warfare, which could be used to counter the Chinese.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but a lot of military technology is reliant on the U.S. And then Taiwan's technology supply chains are so tightly integrated with China that makes it very difficult to separate it out for security purposes. And then, as we see in Ukraine, drones or these others, technological warfare, it's very bottom up. It's just tinkering and trying new approaches. And I think Taiwan, the tech industry, can be very top down in some times.
Okay, interesting. How is Donald Trump viewed in Taiwan?
I think he's, interestingly enough, during his first term, there are people that often would whitewash his actions, or they would not perceive the vast difference between him and past American presidents.
Okay.
Because news in Taiwan reporting on international events is often very selective.
Okay.
They didn't get the full picture. But I think in Donald Trump 2.0 in his second term, I think there's much more awareness of how unreliable he is and dangerous he can be.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious he's very different to previous U.S. presidents now. I think the corruption is on a very large scale, like both financially and the way he is trying to centralize power is quite scary. I think whitewashing isn't going to work anymore.
Interesting. I think many in Taiwan are not aware of that, though. The U.S. is perceived through the frame of one issue, which is support for Taiwan.
Okay.
And so people are not aware of Doge or of the ICE raids or all these other events that are going on in the U.S. Yeah, I think there's quite a lack of awareness of that.
Okay, that's very interesting. And does Chinese popular culture seep into Taiwan, through TikTok and other apps? Does Chinese popular culture influence Taiwan in any way?
Yes, it definitely does, and that can be through TikTok, but also music, oftentimes variety shows, talent shows, for example. And so there are a lot of people that are consuming Chinese media, but I don't actually necessarily think that impacts views on nationality or national identity. It is soft power, sure, but it's the case that Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China were interchanging culture for in media for the 80s until the present. And so it's true China is much larger today, but I don't think it will necessarily have the greatest impact on identity. Okay,
interesting. So I'm trying to think how to phrase this question. I kind of want to get it right. But so sometimes student protests and maybe left-wing activism in the US and Europe as well is framed around an anti-capitalist lens, or maybe like a quasi-Marxist or socialist lens. Like you see this with the surprising election, or the surprising mayoral candidate in New York, who identifies as democratic socialist. Yeah, exactly. So does that play out differently in Taiwan? Because obviously, due to the proximity to China and the tension with China, and China being officially on paper a communist country, does grassroots activism maybe take a different form and reject socialism, or
not really? Actually,
okay.
There's actually a lot of interest in leftist ideas, and I think among progressive young people, yes, particularly in the years around the time of the Sunflower Movement, there are all these different left-wing reading groups that rejected China, sure, but also are pro-independence, for example.
Okay,
the independence strain of Taiwanese politics, in fact, has roots in the political left. For example, the father of Taiwanese independence, Su Bing, was someone that was a leftist. He actually worked with the CCP in China, then broke with them because he disagreed with the Cultural Revolution and went back to Taiwan and tried to assassinate Chiang Kai-shek.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of these lineages that are, in fact, very left-wing for Taiwan identity.
Wow, okay. That's very interesting.
It's very interesting. So there is actually not as much a stigmatization of left-wing ideas as you would think. You do have a pushback, I think, in the last few years that's more along the lines of rejecting wokeism and this kind of right-wing rhetoric that is sometimes actually still pro-independence. But for the past decade, the progressive to left-wing strain of independence has been much stronger. That may be changing now in the past 2 years. And I think that has much more to do with, for example, backlash against social media, quote unquote, political correctness, rather than China. But yeah.
Interesting. So has activism in Taiwan, maybe over the last few years, has that played out around social issues like the cost of housing and wages and employment for younger people, or has it played out around more like I guess more around identity issues like you saw in the US? Like, what form does it take?
Yeah, sometimes identity issues. I mean, there's the Great Recall movement, attempt to recall all KMT legislators earlier this year. And last year, there was the Bluebird movement, which is also against the KMT and the largest movement in 10 years. But other issues are environmental, regarding gay marriage, regarding, for example, evictions or things like that. Interestingly, on the issue of housing or low wages, there's not as much union activity. There was in around 2018, but it kind of petered out. But I think the other issue is actually both parties, the DPP and the KMT, agree that basically we need to fix this problem of like unaffordable housing and low wages and long hours. And so the two don't actually disagree on that. They disagree on a lot of other issues, including environment and gender and sexuality. But then they don't actually disagree on that.
Yeah, so across the Western world today, including Europe and the US, and I believe Australia as well, the young people are definitely facing major barriers to owning a house. Like, obviously the cost of housing has skyrocketed. So some people would say some people assume this is just confined to the Western world, but obviously South Korea has major issues with this as well. So would you say those issues like the cost of housing and maybe wages not keeping up with the cost of living, have they been major concerns in Taiwan as well?
Yeah, I think for young people. And the criticism is that, for example, many college graduates make 22,000 NT per month. That was the case 10 years ago. And then to afford a house in Taipei, you'd have to not eat or drink for 15 years.
Wow.
And so it is a major problem. But then both parties don't seem to have the solutions. And that's a challenge, actually.
And has there been any like interventions tried by the government? Like, have they tried maybe supporting people with loans, or has there any housing policies been tried to try and relieve this issue?
Yeah, there's attempts to build much more social housing, but then the pace of construction is very slow. The local and central governments fight about who's responsible. Various housing subsidies, but that's maybe not enough to fix this problem. Part of it is, I think, property hoarding by people that are very wealthy and purchase homes as a form of investment. And so they just own multiple properties. So attempts to tax people more to prevent that from happening. But I think it's still a challenge. And I think the government is sometimes unwilling to rock the boat because vested interests are still very invested in making money this way.
Interesting, yeah. And is there a clear class divide in Taiwan? Like, is there still social mobility, or is that slowed? And maybe is there a generational gap in wealth? Like, how is the wealth divided?
Yeah, there's definitely a generational gap in which boomers have much more than millennials or Gen Z. And that's true anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
It's true that Gini coefficient is not as bad as other parts of the world. In the 1980s, for example, Taiwan had similar level of inequality to the Soviet Union, in fact, which is very surprising for a government that ostensibly is capitalist. But then it has grown definitely since then.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, the Gini coefficient is like one of the main metrics economists use to measure inequality. And actually, funnily enough, China's is quite high. I think it rose over, I think it got into the 40s maybe 10 years ago, and since then I don't think the CCP has actually continued to publish it. So but I think in mainland China, am I correct in saying that like inequality is divided between urban and rural, rather than like you don't really see poor people in cities as such? Like there's
they drive them out.
That as well. Yeah,
Boston, definitely. Countryside.
Yeah. I even read as well that like a lot of homeless people and stuff, maybe people who can't support themselves, are sent to re-education camps. Is that true?
Yes, that does occur.
Yeah, it does occur. Yeah.
Yeah, Taiwan also does have a urban-rural divide, which you see everywhere in the world. But I think Taiwan is also, it's much smaller. And so, for example, I think a fluidity or migration is not as huge an issue. It's like a huge deal, for example. There's a term like northern drift. You move north to seek your fortune in China. But China is such a massive country that moving north is a big deal.
Yeah.
Taiwan is just 2 hours by train.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Actually, I've heard defense analysts say that like the kind of the layout of the urban structure in Taiwan makes it difficult to invade, because am I correct in saying that the major urban centers kind of, as you said, are like more inland, so it would be quite difficult for the People's Liberation Army to actually occupy them. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's actually a big challenge of conducting a beachhead invasion, which is that there are very few beaches in Taiwan that are large enough for that, and the sea conditions are only right 2 times a year, more about basically the spring and the fall, to launch an invasion. And so that makes it very difficult. Taiwan's also mostly mountainous, very suited to guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, guerrilla warfare, yeah.
Yeah, and so the ports, the cities, the major cities in the north and south are there because of the ports, which is, of course, true of many nations.
Yeah.
But then it would still be difficult for China to take that. And then there's questions about defending infrastructure like the airports, for example, or ports in the event of an invasion.
Okay, interesting. So I'm kind of interested in social liberalization in Taiwan. So obviously China still seems quite socially conservative, despite its official communist or social status. So would you consider Taiwanese society socially liberal in terms of like gender norms, or would you still say it has a bit of work to do?
Yeah, I think Taiwan legalized gay marriage as the first country in Asia to do so. How it became that way is actually still a very good question for me. I don't know how, actually, because Taiwan is, of course, very conservative in the authoritarian period.
Okay.
But I think particularly after a democratization, many influences entered Taiwan at once, and that led to this desire to, because of marginalization on the world stage, to put Taiwan as a kind of standard bearer for progressive or advanced or liberal values, framed in those terms.
Yeah.
And so also to differentiate Taiwan from China. And so I think that contributed to allowing for this openness in society today.
Okay. And would you say that, there's a trend in the Western world again, that people tend to get married later and maybe have less kids, and obviously women have joined the workforce and maybe have children later. Like, is that evident in Taiwan as well?
Yes, it's very evident. And so Taiwan has among the lowest birth rates in the world.
Wow, okay.
This is true of any East Asian country. China also has it particularly bad because of one China policy.
Yeah.
But then this is also the case in Taiwan. And so it's because of the unaffordable housing, the cost of raising a child, but also actually often the family pressure against women and just the expectations that society puts on them of being mothers.
Okay, yeah. Actually, like, despite like Taiwan being much smaller in terms of population and landmass, and even like it's probably difficult to build infrastructure because it is mountainous, like you said. Like, Taiwan seems to have completely outperformed many of the Southeast Asian countries and other small, Asian countries as well. Like, why has Taiwan performed so well economically? Like, it obviously industrialized much earlier and it became wealthy and maybe a first world country much earlier. Like, why did that happen, do you think?
It's a very good question, but I think actually a lot of it is there's enormous aid from the U.S. that came in after World War II.
So it was a Cold War thing, you think?
Yes, so there's that. And desire to prop up Taiwan as in contrast to China. And so that's part of it. It is also, when you actually compare the kind of way the government operated, it is also a very state capitalist during that period. And so it allowed for a lot of building of infrastructure. And Taiwan also places bets on the right industries that took off, such as the semiconductor industry, which is directly a product of the party state deciding that this is a critical technology future. We should throw everything into this. Okay.
And does Taiwan operate mostly like on free market economic principles in a purely capitalist framework, or like is there state intervention? Like you said, like does the state subsidize key industries like the Chinese do, and like maybe a lot of countries do to a lesser extent?
It's actually very funny because Taiwan is often juxtaposed as a capitalist country compared to China, but in fact there's enormous amounts of state subsidies and intervention into industry.
Okay.
And so the desire or the expectation is that the state will always bail out industry. And so anytime there's a major hit, then the state will intervene. And that's actually worked out quite well for the economy.
Really? Okay. Yeah. Like, did the semiconductor success happen accidentally? Like, did TSMC just kind of grow out of nowhere? Was that planned? And like, it just seems really interesting that 90% of the world's semiconductor chips are made in one island off the coast in the South China Sea. Like, that's incredible. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I think Taiwan produced many cheaply made goods in the past. There was the era of made in Taiwan. But semiconductors were part of that era in which basically Taiwan quietly made itself indispensable to global supply chains. Basically, what did happen is that the economic leaders that were very tied to the party state looked at what Taiwan's resources and industrial capacity was and decided this was the industry to actually build up. And that worked out actually quite well. And so that's why there's such dominance. And companies like TSMC or UMD have very strong ties to the state in that sense.
Do you think the geopolitical leverage of Taiwan would look different if it wasn't for the semiconductor industry?
Honestly, I actually don't think so. The thing is that we only started talking about semiconductors or realizing how important they are around 5 years ago because of COVID.
Yeah.
But then it quietly built itself up. But we had always talked about Taiwan as a geopolitical flashpoint before that. Because historically speaking as well, in pre-modern times to the present, it's really about the geography of Taiwan and where it's located in the Asia Pacific that there's this desire for it.
Okay, interesting. How is AI viewed in Taiwan? Because I think I saw something recently that is DeepSeek banned in use by corporations now because of Chinese influence?
I think there's concerns about the data getting out to China, particularly for IPs and things like that. In government institutions, it's definitely banned. But then AI, there's a desire to get onto this trend because there's, again, this wish for Taiwan to maintain its foothold in terms of critical industries. And so AI is the next wave. But then, interestingly enough, Taiwan is actually not very strong in terms of software. It's very strong in terms of hardware.
Yeah.
And so then it actually becomes about the chips that you use for AI.
Okay. So is there any software development companies at all in Taiwan? Like, is it?
There are many.
Okay.
But I actually think the world for development is in fact much larger in China.
Okay.
And so that also does lead to brain drain to China, including with the AI sector sometimes as well.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about the chip restrictions that were introduced by Biden. So how has that affected China in terms of actually being able to get hold of these key chips?
So it still keeps happening. China still keeps getting these key chips and maybe routed through Taiwan or elsewhere.
Okay.
And Jensen Huang, the NVIDIA CEO, has now convinced Trump to allow NVIDIA to have the export license to China if they pay the US 15%.
Okay.
And so this is it's obviously a large market. And so Huang wants to get there. But his argument is that actually, which is also, I think, a bit interesting and nuanced, is that basically if you really block China from having easy access to these chips, you're going to actually cause the government to put so much more into developing domestic capacity that you'll actually lose out. And I think there's an argument for that as well. I think there's actually a point to that.
Interesting. So you think maybe you would be in favor of China having some access to chips, maybe?
I'm agnostic on that issue, but then I think it's an interesting argument, and I don't know enough about the let's say cutting edge or bleeding edge developments in the chip industry to have an opinion on that.
Okay, interesting. Let's just talk about the Taiwanese education system for a second. So does the Taiwanese education system gear students towards key industries, or does it just provide maybe a broad liberal education, liberal arts education? How does it function here?
Yeah, this is also a very interesting question because for the chip industry, there were several universities that really fed into it. Jiao Tong University and Tsinghua University. And so that allows for cultivating the talent that you need for the semiconductor industry. But historically, the best and the brightest were sent to become doctors. And so doctors were very well respected in society from the Japanese colonial period to the present. And this is also why we have an overrepresentation of doctors in politics.
Oh, right, okay.
Because they're political leaders. Just as many countries, they're lawyers as the politicians. In Taiwan, it's doctors and lawyers.
Does that mean you have a strong health system?
That's also true. There's universal health care and so forth.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. So that's also quite a nice to
interesting. And outside of universal health care, is there any other social safety net policies that the government, you mentioned social housing earlier, has any other social safety net policies the government have introduced or tried to develop over the years actually been successful to help Taiwanese people? Yeah,
I think the amount of homeless in Taipei, for example, is quite low.
Yeah, I noticed that.
There's still a lot of social services that provide, but not enough. I think that there's a lot of care centers for the elderly and attempts to build up infrastructure to give elderly things to do, community colleges and so forth. That has been, I think, relatively successful.
That's good.
I think also just building new kind of infrastructure for transportation to make life more convenient. That's kind of an ongoing process always.
Yeah.
And so I think that has worked out quite well. But yeah, I think it is the universal healthcare system is interesting enough, something that both parties quite like, in fact.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. And I guess the infrastructure is really, really good in Taiwan. Do most people in Taipei not own a car, and do they just get the metro and the underground?
Actually, I don't know the statistics, but many people can get around this way, and it is very easy to get around just without a car.
And there hasn't really been a huge embrace of electric cars in Taiwan like there is in the Chinese mainland, is there?
There actually has been. It's not as, I think, dramatic, because I think China can, in fact, enact some very top-down shifts in that sense.
Okay.
But the number of EVs has increased dramatically. Scooters as well, because scooters are quite noisy and polluting, and now you have GoGo scooters everywhere.
Yeah.
The police also use GoGo scooters, and you see buses that are electric buses now. So it's the urban landscape has changed in that way. It's much quieter, actually, even compared to a few years ago.
Yeah. So out of curiosity, do parents still encourage their kids to go and become doctors? Is that still seen as an easy route to success, or maybe a viable route to success and wealth? Or do people say maybe you should go and become an engineer and work for TSMC? How does that work? What's the ideal solution?
Now. I think that's actually, we're in the process of seeing that occur.
Okay.
So I think TSMC engineer is becoming now the rock
stars.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, interesting. So less doctors maybe.
Yes. Yeah. And TSMC is known for very, very long working hours, but also high pay, and also many benefits. And so it is a trade-off. It's still extremely long working hours, but I think that this is now becoming the desirable job.
Okay, interesting. What's the second best place to visit outside of Taipei in Taiwan?
I think Tainan is important to visit. It's the historical capital.
Okay.
It's very small. It's like a day trip. There's that. But then also Hualien on the east coast is the most beautiful part of the country. You have mountains, then you have a beach, and you have the ocean.
Okay.
The issue is that because there was a large earthquake some time ago, maybe half a year ago, there's still some damaged infrastructure there. So it may be a bit harder to get around.
So Taiwan's obviously really beautiful and it's an island nation. Why hasn't it taken off as like a backpacking destination like some places in South, like Vietnam or Thailand or even Cambodia and Laos in Southeast Asia? Is it because of maybe reliance or the build out of other sectors that took priority over tourism, or is it because of the lack of beaches like you mentioned, or is it just a combination of multiple, or maybe is it because people associate it as somewhere that's difficult to get to? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question actually, and I think part of it is hotels are much more expensive.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah, which I think is an issue for backpacking. But then Taiwan has not been clever enough about tourism strategy to frame itself as such.
Okay.
It's often...
There's definitely potential there.
Yes. I think the issue is, in fact, that Taiwan framed itself along the lines of China historically. And so you cannot outcompete China when it comes to tourism or the grandeur of ancient history. And so you have to find something that's different, distinctive to brand yourself. And that could be backpacking, but the government is very bureaucratic and slow to think about that we should shift towards this.
Yeah, because again, for like the average backpacker, maybe someone under the age of 25, like Taiwan would probably be too expensive. There's not enough hostels, and like you said, the accommodation is too expensive. So yeah,
and I think there's not enough hostels around, and I think Taiwan still hasn't developed that culture yet.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe it'll come. Actually, like you mentioned this earlier. You said before, like maybe 10 years ago or more, there was more Western tourists in China. We saw very few Western tourists in China, like especially. Actually, in every city, but definitely after Beijing and Shanghai, like Chongqing had very little. Like the western province Yunnan, there was I don't think I saw any, maybe one or two. So
it's very striking. Just the number of students, foreign students studying in China, has also declined dramatically, and just the amount of tourism as well. That's deliberate, but also a product of, I think, tensions between the West and China.
Okay.
But I think it's quite unfortunate, actually.
Yeah. Because again, China has, like you said, it's a historically very important country, and like it might as well be a continent.
It is the size of a continent. There's many things to see there.
Yeah, it's amazing. And again, like we did try to get as much done as possible. We still didn't see everything we wanted to see. Like we'd have to come back.
I think also just entire regions that are not as accessible because of political reasons. Tibet and Xinjiang, for example.
Yeah, like the situation in Tibet is actually quite concerning. Why did China try and crush Tibetan independence, or why they try and like bring Tibet under Chinese control? Like why is the grip so tight there?
The current People's Republic of China inherited the borders of the Qing Empire, and Tibet had been incorporated, but also relatively recently. And so it's a desire to maintain these historically independent, in fact, nation states into the China that is much larger than before. And so then assimilation policy, which is very much modeled after the Soviet Union, for example, in terms of the Eastern Bloc, that was also implemented with regards to Tibet and Xinjiang and the other ethnic minority groups as well. And so those are the largest, in fact, but we often don't hear about the other groups that there was also this attempt to stamp out culture and force assimilation. Yeah,
obviously the Uyghurs is the major one that's talked about internationally, but I believe there's other ethnic groups as well that have suffered under Chinese rule.
And there's much more talk of Uyghurs in the past decade because that's when the camps, the re-education camps have been implemented. But then before that, actually, people were not talking about this. And there was a long time until, I think, around the midpoint of the last decade where people suddenly started becoming aware of that this had been occurring for some time.
Yeah. It's a strange question, but I thought about it when I was in China. It seems like it would be impossible for China to have a missing persons list, or for someone to disappear in China.
It's still possible.
Is it really?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I keep track of the number of Taiwanese that disappear in China, and some are they disappeared. Some are probably accidents.
Yeah.
Some are there's at least like 100 that are thought to be accidents.
Okay.
Something around that, and so there are actually people that still disappear, and so it's just like usually an accident. You go hiking and you fall or something like that.
Okay, so it is possible.
Yes.
Okay, I would have thought it's almost impossible because the prevalence, the surveillance state, but I guess maybe that doesn't cover everywhere.
Yeah.
Interesting. Who are Taiwan's allies in Asia? So obviously the Chinese have made a massive effort to the Belt and Road Initiative to try and maybe form allies across the global south. So like, who do you think is still loyal to Taiwan, and has the Belt and Road Initiative actually been successful for Beijing in generating more allies?
Yeah, I think particularly Taiwan has strong ties with Japan. Part of it is historical and cultural, but also security ties because, for example, you look at Okinawa, and the closest island of Okinawa is in fact very close to Taiwan. Okinawa is geographically closer to Taiwan than to the rest of the Japanese archipelago. And so Japan would potentially be embroiled by a conflict even without considering the U.S. bases there. So there's that. But also increasing the Philippines because of tensions in the South China Seas, but also geographic proximity. And so the Philippines is very close. I mean, for example, indigenous Taiwanese are very related to Austronesian peoples, including from the Philippines. And so that shows the geographic proximity. And so they're also potentially embroiled into conflict. So I think more and more countries are realizing they might get pulled into a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. South Korea less so, but I think it's also a product of the fact that they have their politics regarding North Korea and also North Korea's backer, which is China. And there's that. And Taiwan also tries to build up ties with other countries, but Southeast Asian countries are often also authoritarian regimes that are quite close to China.
Yeah. What about India?
India, because of the tensions with China, has been much more interested in Taiwan. But India cannot project power into the Asia Pacific the same way.
Okay. Because it's just not
It's
industrialized.
just too far.
The distance. Okay. So, like, has there been a bit of a detente in relations between Modi and Xi? Because obviously, there's a state visit organized for the first time in several years. It's like, do you think there's a change, like a sea change there, or do you think it's maybe going to be short-lived?
It's a good question. I think Modi is a hyper-nationalist that also needs to answer to his own incredibly anti-China base. But then I think both powers are considering now because of the questions regarding the U.S.
Okay.
And so I think this is another question. Taiwan has benefited in building strong ties with India, which are touted as being on the virtue of democracy, but then Modi is in fact a quite authoritarian actor. So Taiwan kind of conveniently ignores that.
Yeah. Do you think like democracy in several Asian countries, like in general in Asian countries, is it just like a gradual process that eventually there's more individual and economic freedom and it comes like, will India follow the same path as maybe Taiwan or South Korea and eventually become fully or maybe largely democratic, or do you think it might go down the road of China and kind of keep with those authoritarian tendencies?
It's a good question. I think it really does depend. I think Indian society, I mean, it is the world's largest democracy, but then Modi talks about not having elections again and things like that, and has a very almost theocratic view of the world. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think that is where India could go down the path of China.
Okay.
And having such a massive country like that, which will also, I think, economically develop in the future, can also be very dangerous. Perhaps not to Taiwan, but to the other countries in the region. And I think the tensions regarding, for example, historical treaties around water conservancy in, for example, Nepal, India, China, and the fact that those are being suspended now under Modi, that is very, very dangerous. And there will be countries, particularly in Central Asia, that depend on this watershed for literally water that will be impacted. And so that is very concerning to me.
Yeah.
It probably will not impact Taiwan, but I find it just concerning as a person.
Yeah, interesting. So I remember when Trump visited Qatar, maybe a few months back now, he kind of praised the Qataris for gaining wealth and prosperity in a different way to like the traditional neoliberal economic and democratic model. Like, do you think that China is just going to continue using maybe an alternative model to neoliberal economics and like democracy and just form a powerful and wealthy state in a different way that looks completely different to wealthy nations like the US and others throughout the 20th century? Like, do you think it's just something fundamentally different, or do you think it'll eventually democratize?
I think it's very much the East Asian model of development, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, in which the state is very much interventionist in a free market. So it is capitalist at the end of the day, but the state is very involved. And so I think it'll continue down that. And of those, we see South Korea often still has political instability. The presidents, the attempts to have coups. There was the one recently, but also 10 years ago, there was also the Candlelight Movement in which Park Geun-hye, the daughter of the former dictator, was conducting also just political targeting. Japan is, in fact, a one-party state. The Liberal Democratic Party has basically ruled since World War II. Opposition, it is a democracy, yes, but the opposition has never been able to rise up. And so then Taiwan is the only one that seems to be, there's Singapore too. Singapore is led by a family oligarchy. Taiwan is the one that is that's actually
truly democratic.
Yes, the exception. And
implemented democracy successfully over many years.
Yes, and I think that was an accident because of the relation to China, in fact.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Taiwan would have gone down a similar path. I mean, we look at the Taipei mayor, and he is the great-grandson of Chiang Kai-shek. So there's this authoritarian nostalgia that we see in other parts of Asia that have elected often the children of dictators, such as Park Geun-hye 10 years ago in South Korea, but also Marcos Jr. in the Philippines, for example.
Do you think, is it a cultural thing that influences Asian societies to not push for democracy as much as other parts of the world, or is it just maybe like an accident or a chance of history?
It's a very good question. I mean, democracy is in fact a very recent idea. I mean, historically speaking. And so I think it's still a challenge in Asian countries that in the 20th century we're playing catch up in terms of development with the West. And now what do we do now? And so It's very much a question. I mean, I think particularly with the Eastern Europe, we see a similar trajectory with, say, Russia, which is, of course, an empire before the Russian Revolution, and then modernization occurred under communist auspices. So it's, I think, an open question.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm going to give you a few rapid-fire questions before we finish.
Sure.
So just things that pop into my mind. So what's your favorite Taiwanese food?
Oh, it's a tough question. Yeah, I don't think about it that much. I don't feel like I think about it as a favorite food, but I have to think a bit about what would be my favorite food. I think probably I eat a lot of just the generic Taiwanese lunch boxes.
Okay.
So that's a terrible answer, though.
Okay, what food is touted as maybe a must-try in Taiwan?
Usually the braised pork rice.
Okay.
So it's like the national dish, and it's like a staple food. But then also the beef noodles, also stinky tofu. Those are all things I enjoy, but it's hard to think of what is exactly like a favorite food.
Who's the most impactful pop culture figure in Taiwan?
That's a very good question. I think it may be like a pop idol of like Wang Lihong or something like that, who is now canceled because he had a rather nasty divorce and affair. But then someone like that, just in terms of the cultural influence or setting an aesthetic for particularly like the 2000s, I think someone like that is very important.
Okay. Does Taiwan have a right-left divide or a conservative-liberal divide in politics?
It does, but it matches on to the independence unification divide.
Okay.
And that is still more important.
Yeah, interesting. So that supersedes any liberal and conservative divide?
It does, but also independence is still currently more left-wing associated. Okay. And that it does rebalance from time to time, but the KMT is historically more right-wing. I think it's always associated with the status quo.
Okay. Have you seen Squid Games?
No, I've not.
Okay. Do you think that level of maybe competition and class warfare applies in Taiwan, or is it a completely different?
It's actually very interesting because Taiwan has routinely like the 4th or 5th longest working hours in the world. It's a very exploitive society, but it's not on the level of South Korea or Japan, in which everyone's wearing a suit and there's salaryman culture and you have to drink with your boss until dawn. And the level of hierarchy, for example, where in South Korea, people try to figure out each other's ages, and if you toast somebody and you're the older person, your glass needs to be on top. It's not that level of hierarchy. And so even though there's these issues regarding long working hours.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So what type of music is popular in Taiwan, especially amongst maybe people under 30?
So just like mainstream pop, but then also young people are increasingly into indie. And so indie has increasingly become the new kind of like mainstream music. I think also this kind of rejection of just consumerist society in that sense. And people want something that's more
authentic?
Yes, authentic.
Do people here listen to K-pop?
People do. And that's also been a very big influence in the past few years. You see it much more in fashion, stores, influence in pop culture.
Okay. Do students in Taiwan take drugs?
Very much no. This is actually very interesting. Very conservative attitudes on drugs. On cannabis, there's much more liberal attitudes, but people are afraid of anything else. Interesting enough, drug usage is highest among the working class in the countryside, people that work very hard jobs as a kind of painkillers and things like that.
So if you lined up 100 college students, maybe who've graduated in the last 5 years, and you asked all of them anonymously to state whether they've taken LSD or not, would the answer be no for all of them?
Yes, I would say almost no, for all of them. You might get someone that's traveled to Thailand or the US and smoked cannabis before. Okay. But that's the only drug usage you'd probably find.
Very interesting. Okay. Is there any country music in Taiwan, like folk music or something like that?
Yes, there is. And there's different versions. There's a kind of like nakasi, very working class, Japanese influenced, but also like classic taika rock. Taika is like a term used to refer to working class Taiwanese that are Benjamin from the previous waves of migration. But that rock is very distinctive, and that still exists.
Okay, interesting. Is there like a gym or bodybuilding or sports culture in Taiwan?
Yes, that's also taken off in recent years, and you see that in various parts of the city. Usually like Western chains, Western gym chains, and so that's happened. I think that's also changed a lot in the past few years.
Is there Instagram influencers?
Yes, there's a lot of Instagram influencers, and so any cafe, if you go there on an afternoon, you'll see someone just taking a photo shoot in the middle of it.
Maybe last question. Do young people actually converse about the possibility of Chinese militancy against Taiwan? Is it something that comes up in discourse?
I think it's very rare. I think it's still very rare. People don't think about it seriously. But I think the thing is not to, it comes and goes. Sometimes it's very abstract, sometimes it's very concrete. And so young people act on it when it's concrete. And other times it floats in the back of your head because it's been more than one generation now that this has been a threat. Okay. And so it's increasingly abstract for some people.
Okay. So it's almost like people have acclimatized to it.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Actually, final last question. Are dating apps a thing in Taiwan?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Common?
I think a lot of people are actually still very afraid of dating apps because the other thing is Taiwan is so small that basically, oh wow, people are going to see me on an app and that kind of thing.
What about China, mainland China?
I actually don't know as much. I actually don't know much. In the past decade, I haven't really been able to travel to China.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because there actually seems to be a bit of an age, maybe a more common age gap with men being older in China than women than I would see in the West.
The other thing is I think the gender stigma is higher. For example, the term leftover women refer to women that have not married past age 30.
Okay.
That stigma doesn't really exist in Taiwan to the same extent.
Yeah.
So China, despite the socialist past of women hold up half the sky, in fact, has very, very strong conservative gender norms on that.
Okay. Are you optimistic about the future of Taiwan overall?
I think in general, yes, actually.
Okay.
I'm actually a rather pessimistic person, but I think that I am actually rather optimistic about the politics of Taiwan in the future because I think it's still going in a positive direction on the whole.
Okay, fantastic. Brian, thanks a million. That was really good. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're a really good speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, I do a lot of media stuff.